Excellent. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the OI. My name is Luc Rocher. I'm a lecturer researcher and also program director for the DPhil in social data science. Welcome to everyone in person and, of course, online, because I think we have quite a lot of people online. I have a few things that I have to say. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the events. So there will be a presentation and panel discussion for about 40 minutes. And then there will be time for Q&A for about 20 minutes. If you're in the room, if you can keep questions for the end, would be appreciated. And if you're online, so there will be time at the end. You have the choice to already enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will read them. But you can also raise your hand. But in this case, you will be recorded while you ask your questions. Today we have Corinne Cat with us and Ashwin, Matthew, but also Young Ao, who is not here in person, was ill today, but sent us a recording, brief recording, which we will share on screen. Brief introduction. So Young Ao was not able to join today. He's a PhD researcher at the OI and also a Clarendon Scholar and Global Histories of Capitalism Scholar. And the thesis examined the export of surveillance technology at the intersection of science, technology, and society, geography, and also sociology. The research tried to explore the vast industry that underpinned the pervasive surveillance technology and infrastructure and the colonial legacies that reify, reproduce, and also can be resisted. And then we have Ashwin, who is an ethnographer of internet infrastructure. Is that right? That's right. Wonderful. Studying technologies and also the technical communities that also construct, operate the internet globally, and looking at how the internet is being built, operated, maintained in its everyday practice, and also how the culture of these technical communities circulate across global south and global north in the process of operating the internet. And last but not least, we have Corinne Cat here, who is an alumni of the OI, where she did a DPhil and graduated in 2021, so 3 years ago, studying politics of internet infrastructure, human rights advocacy within it, and working with Vicky Nash and Gina Neff. And they're currently postdoctoral researcher at the University of Delft with Seda Gussus, where they investigate how the public internet is being eaten by cloud computing and the resulting extractive business model. Thank you all. Corinne, the floor is yours.
Okay. It is very nice and also a little bit daunting to be giving a talk in this room where I had some of my statistics classes and exams. So I have mixed feelings about being in the room, but it's very nice to be back at the OII. Thanks so much for coming out tonight for this panel discussion, which came out of a book that I edited that Young and Ashwin and many others have very gracefully contributed to. For anyone who wants to read it, there should now be a copy in the library here. You can also email me about a free PDF or get a copy online from Meetspace Press. So this is a bit about my background, which I can skip because Luc, much better than I could, has already given the introduction. But my name is Corinne. I did my DPhil here, and I'm now a postdoc at the University of Delft in the Netherlands, which is where I'm from. This is what the book looks like. I actually have a couple of hard copies with me for people who are interested in getting one off of me after. And the reason why we're here together is because what this book tries to do is really look at what power in the internet industry will look like in the future and how much of it will be tied to the organizations that own and control its infrastructure. And the book does this by really taking a global look at infrastructure politics all the way from here in the UK to India and back again. And what I want to do today is give a bit of a broader overview as to why we put this book together. Some of the key topics as I've decided to focus on them because the beauty of the book is it has a lot of different voices in it. And Ashwin and Young will both present their own takes on what is most urgent and current in internet infrastructure. And I will probably skip my own research example because I'm actually more interested in doing the panel and hearing from everyone in the room. then talking about my DPhil, which much as I loved working with you both, at some point it's nice not to have to talk about your research anymore. So how did this book come about? So it came out of my PhD research. It's 15 chapters on how internet infrastructure is eating into society. And how the internet is becoming much more than a communications network. Because what I've seen throughout my research as a DPhil, but also now as a postdoc, is that the nature and the function of the internet is changing as it becomes both a digital backbone to politics and economics, at least in the minority world and its economy. And what the book does is take quite an expansive look at infrastructure, because the first question that I always get, especially from academics, is what do you mean by infrastructure? Now, in the book, that is everything from the very, very material, so cables, satellites, to software, to standards. In my current work as a postdoc, I take an even narrower view, and we look at cloud computing, connectivity, and devices. But because what I really wanted to do is not prescribe what infrastructure should look like to the people who are grappling with it on the ground, is that we let all of the authors be very clear about what it meant to them based on the kind of issues that they ran into. And that is especially interesting when you're doing work that involves a lot of non-academics. So many of the people in the book are activists or work for government or are in other ways involved in research, but not necessarily see themselves as academics as such. Some of the book's contributors include names that I'm sure are familiar to this room. So Meredith Whitaker, who is currently the president of the Signal Foundation, Joan Donovan, the well-known mis and disinformation scholar, obviously Ashwin and Young, Michael Veal, who's in London, also contributed the chapter, and some of the folks at the Critical Infrastructure Lab at the University of Amsterdam, who I also work with, also added to the book. And so the book's topics look at anything from the interstellar space ambitions of Amazon to the colonial legacy of the telco infrastructure in the Philippines to how to use data walks to uncover surveillance infrastructure in the city of Amsterdam. And these things always come about in the most silly of ways. So in December of 2020, I was in the final throes of writing up a DPhil, while also quite miserable and pregnant. And my friend, Dr. Joe Shaw, who's also an alumni of this department, was my word count accountability buddy. So every day I would send him, today was 300, and he would be like, excellent. And today it was none. And he was like, what's wrong with you? And I was complaining about how solitary and lonely of an endeavor writing up a PhD can be. And his response to that was like, well, it seems like you have been working with a lot of people doing excellent work in this field. So how about to make this whole last bit of the journey a little bit more interesting and encouraging for you, you think of what a book would look like where you get all of your favorite people together to write on this in a way that is accessible and meant for much more of a lay audience than your PhD will be. And at the time I was like, sure, I'm finishing up a PhD and I'm pregnant, more work. This is what I need. So it seemed like a wonderful time. 3.5 years later, the book was here. It was still wonderful, but it was definitely a bit more work than I might have anticipated at the time, but I'm very excited about it. I think it's a very well-rounded and accessible piece of work that really shows infrastructure in its many facets and as it manifests itself across the world. Now, what does the book do? The book obviously argues for a renewed focus on infrastructure as a key locus of power in the tech industry. But that's quite obvious, right? There is a turn towards infrastructure in many fields. Obviously, everyone starts to care about infrastructure. But why should we do that when it comes to the internet? Like, what is happening with infrastructure that makes it so important? And one of the themes of the book is that it really shows that what we used to think of as traditional sources of power in the internet economy, like data, like AI systems, like software, are actually no longer in and of themselves that powerful if you don't also control or own the infrastructure on which that data is gathered or on which that AI system works. And I think this is really where we see some of the unique contributions of the book. And what is going on here is really interesting. What we see is that internet infrastructure, rather than necessarily data or content that is accessed through the network, features a lot in current debates about power. So this is one example from the signing of the Chips and Sciences Act, where semiconductors have now become a plaything for international politics. The Russian takeover of the Ukrainian internet, where they rerouted a lot of the data over Russian telcos instead of over the local infrastructure. And here are some of my favorites that really speak to the importance of infrastructure if you want to exert power. This is not an Onion article, even though first time I saw it, that's what I thought it was, when it said, Google steps up Microsoft's criticism warrants of rivals' monopoly in cloud. Or in other words, you're so big, this is very unfair. But it's actually a Reuters article. And this particular fight is about Microsoft and Google's cloud computing businesses, where Google says some of the licensing practices that you have are anti-competitive. And here, again, we see at the time Facebook, but now Meta, say, in a wonderful turn of events, Apple, you are too powerful. Because what had happened at the time is that Facebook was complaining about the fact that the Apple ecosystem had essentially revised its operating software in a way that it could allow individual users like us to switch off tracking of third-party apps. And once that was an opportunity, most people did, which meant that Facebook could no longer track, which is a key part of their model, because of the fact that Apple owns so much of the infrastructure, not just most of our devices, but also the operating system on which it runs. And again, does this mean we should feel sorry for Facebook? Not something I personally feel is necessary, but it is really interesting because it shows that for data or for tracking to be effective or to be a lever of power in the current internet industry, you need to have control over the infrastructure. And Facebook doesn't. And this is one of the biggest things that they also will talk about as one of the weaknesses in their model. Right? They just make software. They don't have much hardware. And so they're entirely reliant on other people's infrastructure for their business model. So, and it's this particular change where data, software, AI systems, consumer-facing platforms can really no longer be framed as the locus of power in and of themselves or outside of the infrastructural context that holds these things like data. And I think we need to be particularly concerned about this as it is a smaller and smaller number of companies that hold that kind of infrastructural power / ecosystem power. I'm not quite sure what the right term is here. And these are the examples I will be skipping, but happy to talk about those in the Q&A because I saw this come up in my own field work, and it's come up in many other pieces of research that are in the book. And what I want to do now is shift slightly to the work that Young and Ashwin will be doing, taking the perspectives that they are taking out without highlighting too much of the work. This is one of my favorite quotes from Young's chapter. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Ashwin's chapter. And I think what all three of us do is look at infrastructure and see what unusual, new, and worrisome political possibilities reside within it. And with that, I hope that tonight we can really plug our contemporary technology debates in the politics of internet infrastructure and ask how can we ensure that our infrastructure sustains us and doesn't consume us. And then let's see if this works. We will go over to Young, who very gracefully sent a short video outlining their contributions.
Well, yeah, it's working.
Hi everyone, this is Young from the Oxford Internet Institute. I have unfortunately caught the flu, so I could not be there with you all, but thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much, Corinne, Ashwin, and Luke for bringing us together. I will just talk very briefly about one of the chapters in this very timely book Corinne, along with Meat Space Press, has put together. This chapter is called The Sprint to Plug in the Moon. Like my colleagues here, I'm interested in exploring the messy infrastructural dynamics behind the internet and its many interrelated technologies, and importantly, to interrogate the ways we're doing things, to denaturalize particular ideas of progress, and to think alongside the other interventions on how not to be consumed by these very structures we rely on in small and big ways. In this chapter, I take us to the moon. We're following the many public-private initiatives that are claiming extraterrestrial space in various ways. I do this in part to explore the developing power struggles happening in interstellar space, but also to use distance as an analytic to clarify and link what is happening up there and how it is inextricably intertwined in the struggles happening here on Earth. In particular, I highlight how the rush to claim the cosmos brings with it colonial logics. Colonialism is an ongoing system of power predicated on the extractive domination over land, resources, and people. While many actors are contending with their colonial pasts, colonial ways of thinking persist, as do the material inequities of the system. In other words, coloniality endures today, which Maldona's Torres defines as patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that defined culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. To find these threads of coloniality, we can look to who is in outer space already and what is being claimed. In particular, infrastructures for storing and processing data are expanding in outer space. As at present, there are more than 7,500 active satellites. Satellites can be multifunctional in themselves, including acting as small-scale data centers when fitted with a central processing unit. As such, many mini data centers are currently in orbit. The largest modular space station, the 420-ton International Space Station, the ISS, will circle the Earth until its retirement this year. The ISS itself holds about 100 laptops and acts as a data center in various ways. In 2021, the ISS even started minting NFTs as a way to test computing capacity in space. But it is not just governments with ambitious galactic plans. For example, in 2019, Amazon patented a space-based content delivery network. The patent outlines the plans for a geographically distributed network of data centers in outer space and eventually lunar data centers as part of the Amazon Web Service. French company Thales, in collaboration with the Italian and American space agencies, is examining the possibilities of lunar human quarters and computing infrastructures. Lone Star Data Holdings, a US startup, has also announced plans to build data centers on the moon, or what they call the world's ultimate offsite backup location. Another US-based startup called ConnectX has crafted blueprints to store cryptocurrencies off-planet, announcing that space gives ConnectX an unfair advantage. Economically, we do not have to pay for real estate, electricity, cooling, staff, or security. These examples showcase some overarching frameworks of space-based infrastructural projects. Narratives include presenting extraterrestrial bodies as outside of Earth-based capitalist and ownership systems, where these vast empty spaces are up for grabs with anybody with such ambitions. Similarly, is the idea that outer space contains lucrative resources that remain untapped and untaken. We can find threads of coloniality in many ways, but one of the ways it persists is through what Indigenous scholar Leandra Smiles calls fantasies of terra nullius, or no man's land, which some of these narratives embodies. Smile writes, colonial logics are most overt in the invocation of outer space as a wild west, a frontier to be tamed. The question under this framing becomes, if we do not exploit this emptiness, who will? The cosmos is rendered as a frontier like land-based frontiers colonial settlers sought out. Spaces to be claimed for extraction, further settlement, and the preservation of status quo on Earth. Infrastructures for claiming prime real estate and resource extend to orbital pathways, acres of the moon, the planet, and more. This was only a very brief overview of some of the current developments in space. However, it is already clear that it is important at this juncture of time to heed the cautionary tales of colonialism and its myriad harms. Understanding more precisely the ways in which coloniality extends into projects of data infrastructure will help us extricate what interstellar infrastructural injustices might look like. I want to end, though, by reassuring that this line of inquiry is not all just about critiques. In making explicit the violence in our current frameworks, but also denaturalizing these so-called paths of progress, we open up alternative possibilities of the future. For example, instead of selling the moon to the highest bidder, or whoever is the first to plant their titanium flag there, how can we do things anew? In rejecting these colonial relationalities, what might be the implication for these very same processes we have come to accept here on Earth? In the later chapters of this book, and in Corinne and Ashwin's work, much is provoked about the different possibilities of infrastructure, of ways of building trust, and of the commons. Again, I am very sorry I'm unable to be there with you all today, but I'm really excited by these conversations and spaces to build on the diverse work from decolonial activists and scholars in particular, all of which is necessary in order to reassess the cosmic futures we are being collectively signed up for. Thank you very much.
Actually, the floor is yours after we switch some more shake.
One medium to another.
Again for the lots of internets.
I feel it's very apt for a night like this. Anything it demonstrates the problem here.
All right. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation to the book, Corinne. I know that everyone's going to go out and read it now because it's fantastic. And you should. But it was really inspiring to be, I think, in this with this collection of scholars, and I think particularly be here today in conversation with Corinne and with Young, and of course with Luke, who will ask us interesting and difficult questions. In some ways, there are times when I feel like I'm the odd man out in settings like this because I have a perhaps naive optimism. It's not the optimism of the early internet that said, oh, you know, technology will set us all free, or a blockchain, or what have you, pick your buzzword of the day. But it's an optimism that I found from the ethnographic work that I've done on infrastructure by looking at the actual people who manage these systems. Because so much of the time, what we really end up talking about, This is what I get for using open source software, not Microsoft. But so much of the time, what we talk about when we talk about the internet are the large platform companies, the GAFAM, as we like to call them, the struggle between platforms, like right now, the Chinese platforms are coming for us, we must outlaw all of them, hegemonic political struggles. At the same time, we have all of these new technologies, and practically every year, there's a new set of buzzwords, right? Like, oh, the robots are coming, the self-driving cars, are they reliable? Not ChatGPT. And so many social media companies have trust and safety teams, as they call them, saying, we will ensure that our products can be trusted. We will ensure that our users are safe. There's a narrative of trustworthy computing that goes back to the early 2000s saying, how can we make computing trustworthy? And one of the things that came to bother me about some of these narratives, the way that the word trust and trustworthy gets used, is that there's a lot of analytical slippage in what we exactly mean by trust. And that slippage, on the one hand, is convenient, right, for large platform companies and so on, to make claims about what they're doing when in fact they might be doing something else. We'll get to that in a minute. It's also a slippage that is part of the problem of the everyday language that we use. Right? Trust is what some would call a weasel word. It keeps getting away from us. If we try to pin down and say, what do we actually mean by this? You'll find as many opinions as there are people in this room, right? If not more. Pick any academic field, there are scholars of trust who have gone through it in a variety of ways. But here's how this is what I ended up studying, where I had a very different view of what I think the internet is. And I found an internet made of people who manage these systems, who really function on relations of interpersonal trust with each other. This is at places like the Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams. So first, anyone heard of this? Well, currently you don't count. It is an international association of computer security incident response teams, both national and corporate. They've been meeting for, I would say, at least 3 decades or so now. Annual meeting, regional meetings. It's a space in which people can come together and coordinate, share information, build common practice. There are many more organizations like this across the world. This is one of the major international ones. Again, just as a reflection, all of you in this room admittedly work on the internet, have interest in digital technologies, but here's an organization you haven't heard of. Let's take a moment to think about those hidden bits of infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, it's not just the cables and the wires and who owns it, but who operates it? Where do they come together? And what is this thing that they come together and that isn't purely corporate, isn't purely state? It is both of those things. I'm not trying to deny it and say, oh, this is like a brand new alternative. It's not. There's something else going on there that we need to pay attention to. A couple of other places that I did field work were with the North American Network Operators Group, the South Asia Network Operators Group. These are professional organizations for network administrators. So the people who actually manage the networks, interconnect them. So the internet today is over 70,000 interconnected networks, hence the term internet. Right? There was a time when it was going to be called the catanet, for concatenated networks, but sadly, we do not have an internet made of cats. We have our internet. But these are the people who keep the interconnections between networks working. If these people go away, the interconnections go away, quite literally. Right? It's like your plumbers. Your plumber doesn't show up to work over time. Your pipes get corroded. Your water stops flowing. So every time we say that these systems are material, yes, they are. Every time we say that they're owned by large corporations or their hegemonic struggles with governments, yes, they are. But there are also these people who are coordinating in ways that can't be explained only by corporate affiliation or citizenship. It is both of those things. Again, I'm not trying to be naive and say this is completely new, but that's something else going on here as well, which has to do, as we'll talk about, with interpersonal trust. So what do we mean then by trust, and how can we be a bit more rigorous in the way that we use these terms? And I'm going to move through this briefly, but briefly, the problem that trust responds to is a problem of risk. Right? I'm about to engage in some kind of risky interaction with someone else. I'm about to interconnect my network with someone else. I'm a cybersecurity engineer. I found a new vulnerability. I need to share it with other people so I can coordinate a response. Right? That's a risky action. Right? When I interconnect my network with someone else, they might behave badly and cause problems for me. When I share a vulnerability with someone else, they might inadvertently share it with the world before we have a response. Right? These are risks in the everyday practice of operating the internet, but equally in the everyday practice of life. Right? You open a tap, at least in this country, most of this country, you assume that the water is drinkable. Increasingly, it's not, as we know, that's another story. But these are risks that we take, but we often don't think about. And those everyday risks that we don't think about are often characterized in terms of what you might call an assurance structure. Oh, the water is drinkable because we have government agencies, in theory, of what, holding water companies to account, checking that they're behaving as they should, checking that the water is clean. And think of any system like that we take for granted in the world, right? whether it's money, whether it's medicine, what have you. We're constantly relying on assurance structures. But often we don't have choice in these assurance structures. We are engaging in risky action, not thinking about it because we assume we have confidence in these assurance structures. We don't really have choice in them. Trust is something else altogether. So when we talk about things like trustworthy computing, trust and safety teams at large social media companies, we're really talking about assurance structures. We're not talking about trust. And if we can use that notion of confidence and assurance structure as a slightly more rigorous term to think about these problems. The other way you can address risk is through a trust relation. Over time, you take a risk in someone. Corinne asks me to put out a chapter for this book, and she waits months and keeps badgering me. I eventually deliver the chapter. And she's like, okay, so I took a risk. He delivered eventually. Maybe for my next book, I'm going to invite him again, but now I'm going to anticipate. Never mind. But over a period of interactions like this, when you engage in a risky interaction, you build a trust relation with someone. Say, okay, I can trust that person in this particular context. Will Corinne loan me, 10,000 pounds if I ask her to? Probably not. Right? But will she give me an extra few weeks for a book chapter she knows I might deliver? Probably yes. So context really matters when we think about trust relations. And repeated interactions really matter. When we scale these up and think about trust in society at large, we start thinking about broader social networks that we are engaging these kinds of interactions with each other all the time. The network administrators I studied, the cybersecurity engineers I studied, where we are relying on these assurance structures. And that has often been characterized by scholars of modernity, like Newman and Giddens. We call it system trust or a trust in abstract systems. We are engaging in interactions with each other all the time, right? Spending money, driving cars, pick anything, right? Where there's some kind of assurance structure enabling us to engage in these interactions. Another model of trust in society is interpersonal trust. Build large networks in which we come to trust one another. And finally, there's a notion of generalized trust, that within a particular community, within the community of the OII, right, by virtue of being a member of this community, you have a certain level, set of expectations of one another. Right? You may have different opinions of individuals, but there's a certain set of expectations about how others might behave. And so there's a sense of a generalized trust. Now, these are analytically useful categories. It's not like you choose one or the other. All of them are at play in any given social setting, but they're useful to start to pick things apart. And I would argue that the vast majority of problems on the internet that we typically talk about, we're often really talking about assurance structures. And there are other explanations out there, particularly in my case, interpersonal trust, generalized trust, I'm not going to talk about today, which give us a different perspective on what might actually be going on in the internet. So as an ethnographer, I can talk more about particular vignettes from fieldwork that I've done. But I'd probably just give you a few quotes from some of the interviews that I did. So this is from work that I did with network administrators in the North American Network Operators Group and the South Asian Network Operators Group. And the amount of self-reflexivity they have of their own work is quite astonishing. We think that we have theories of the world. They have theories of the world that I think far outsurpass our own. Now, as one network administrator, senior person told me, in the idealized world of humans not being social animals, you'd have really, really high quality, low friction functioning contacts everywhere you need it to. But the reality is the problem with the internet is the people with whom you have no direct adjacency or any direct contractual or financial relationship can ruin your network. Right? We have 70,000 interconnected networks. Someone somewhere at one corner does something bad, whether intentional or not, it can affect everyone else, right? Whether regionally or globally. And we've seen these kinds of failures over and over again. And they will continue to happen because of how complex the internet is. So how do we deal with this? Well, as someone else said, there's lots of communication through back channels, lots of unofficial communication, lots of things nobody can officially talk about. But if we can all share information about it, we can make the internet a better place. So there's lots of communities, and the only way that you gain admission to the community is to be a trusted individual. Interestingly, showing up to meetings of network operator groups, right, is not a problem. I could walk in. Like, no one checked me at the door and said, like, who are you? Why are you here? And pay the fee, attend the meeting, no problem. And they welcome people. And because the theory is, if we can just get more people signed up to common principles of best practice, if we can just get more people signed up to notions of making the internet a better place, however, broad that might be, if we might not entirely agree upon it, we can bring more people into these communities and build coordination across the internet. Then we can actually make all of our jobs easier. And so these communities were really open, and in a sense, they were open circulations of trust and practice across geographies, in my case, across North America and South Asia, but there's similar kinds of network operator groups in every geography in the world. The Middle East Network Operators Group, the African Network Operators Group, pick a geography, you'll find one. Let me give you a different kind of story from cybersecurity engineers, where we find much more constrained circulations of trust and practice because of the sensitivity of the information that they're sharing with each other. As one person said, especially within this environment, trust is everything from people we hire to how we approach rolling out security solutions. Right? So hiring someone, it's not just what do you know, it's do I know you and are you trustworthy? Are you going to be a threat actor who is finding their way into my company and getting hold of this sensitive information we're managing? A really senior chief information security officer had this to say, I'll take all the information that I can collect and gather, but I'm very slow to release information. I don't really give out information unless I absolutely inherently trust somebody with my life. There has to be trust gained over repeated interactions for a number of years before we feel comfortable sharing with each other. And finally, someone talking about, information sharing arrangements. There are many that are corporate, where companies come together to share information in different ways. Sometimes governments mediate that information sharing. But as someone said, yes, we've got these things, they're fine. But here's what really works. The thing that was most effective was that you had someone personally vouch for each individual within a given information sharing network. It's not the companies, not their organizations, the individual. And someone who's already part of it has to vouch for them. It was the individuals who participated as opposed to teams. That fixed most of the problems right there. And as people told me in many of these information sharing groups, if the person you vouched for violates the trust of the group, not only will that person get kicked out, the person who recommended them would get kicked out as well. Right? So they're creating real significant stakes to bringing new people into these groups. And so for me, then, this is what the internet looks like. You've got this political, economic, material organization, which is, I think, what we spend most of our time talking about. But part of what makes that organization stable, part of what makes it function, are these social networks of interpersonal trust relationships that I've been talking about, which are sustained within network operators groups, cybersecurity groups like FIRST, and many others that span the world. These are part of the infrastructure and a really critical part of the infrastructure. Trust is an integral part of the infrastructure as much as any of these other explanations that we see. And in my view, it gives us an interesting set of political options and ways in, again, that are not necessarily transformative, but I think can give us different and useful ways of thinking about the internet and its possibilities.
Yeah, otherwise we won't have your. Thank you. This is your.
For what time is it? We have maybe time for one question each.
Yeah.
But maybe starting with you, Ashwin.
Sure.
So I think what I find interesting is that if I connect my computer to the internet here, I can start sending emails to everyone on Earth. And I could, like, in 5 minutes decide to send like billions of emails, but no one is going to receive them. because Gmail is gonna say, oh, it's probably spam, and I block it. And Microsoft is gonna say the same. And that was not the case 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I think based on trust in the system, etc., the lack of like less spam maybe or DDoS, it would have been possible to email everyone. So the notion of trust has shifted over time, it seems to me. And I wonder if you see, I don't know, do you agree with this? Do you think that like there's getting more and more trust in the system, or actually there's like more control of this like layer of trust in infrastructure?
So I think if we go back to the analytics, right, and think about assurance structures versus actual trust. You think about these large companies, when a point that I think one of the other authors in the book, I think was Meredith in the interview, makes, is that the more infrastructure someone has, the more they get, right? Because you get increasing returns to the amount of power you have with infrastructure. So when you talk about a Microsoft or a Google, or these companies that we constantly talk about, they are not benefiting from increasing returns to their control over infrastructure. It is in their interest to keep their infrastructure well ordered. And part of that is saying, okay, we have our own spam controls. Now that we've got, I know, hundreds of millions of people, at least, if not billions of people on our services, then we can train them and make decisions about what is or is not spam. There were, and there are, alternatives to the spam mechanisms managed by these large companies where we have single sources of big data, as we call it now. Things like DNSBL, Spam Assassin, a whole bunch of spam detection mechanisms that were community-led. Right? In fact, many of them still show up to FIRST, the organization that I was talking about, where they coordinate with each other. Part of the debate at FIRST is between email providers, right, who are, they're like the email newsletter providers saying we want to get our email out, please don't treat us as spam, and the spam classifiers. And some of them, of course, the Googles and so on, right? But many of them, the cooperative endeavors that came from different email operators or different network operators saying something bad is happening on our network. If we can just collaborate to try and have a collective response, our jobs are going to become easier. And I think what was really interesting about the early internet, if you will, and still is very much present in the modern internet, but perhaps more hidden away in the infrastructure, is that those kinds of efforts really became integral to the operation of internet infrastructure. Right? That if we wanted to deal with spam, it required collaborative work amongst individuals who trusted one another. Right? And eventually with companies that said, okay, here's DNSBL, Spam Assassin, these seem like reasonable block lists because we know the individuals who are actually managing those, and we think that those individuals are trustworthy and responsible. Right? As opposed to now where we don't really have a choice anymore. Right? And so it's more a matter of having confidence in the assurances provided by a Google or a Microsoft, rather than trust in the individuals who have an interest in maintaining those systems.
Thank you. Yeah, moving on to you, Corinne. So it's back maybe piggybacking on the like Spam Assassin and things like this. So a few years ago, I had a lot of friends who were like hosting their own like server at home on the in the living room. And yeah, like if their like domain would be blocked, they would go on Spam Assassin and the block list and ask for the computer to be removed. They would be humans who say, okay, I think this is the right request. And now we have this like big giants who like mediate a lot of this. It's not possible to host your own email address. It's not possible to do a lot of things that were possible actually in early days of internet. And I wonder, like, as social scientists, like, what do you think is like the theory of change, or things that social scientists should like critically look at, like places they should be part of, things they should not, like, I don't know, say like, oh, the alternative to Google is hosting your own server. Like, where do you draw the line to be critical?
I think that's a really good question, and one of the biggest and hardest problems that we have at the moment. And I saw this particular problem come up in my field work. I worked with human rights advocates who were trying to work alongside corporate engineers to try and figure out how they could, for instance, make the internet more privacy preserving. And it turns out that in this particular case, a lot of the technologies that you would use for that, like for instance, stronger encryption, were only effective because they could be deployed on a large scale by a limited number of companies. So as they progressed in the work and they were thinking, oh, we are doing pro-privacy work, right? We are doing the good work here. They eventually realized like, oh, because of the reality of how the internet is only run by these 5 companies, and it's only these companies that actually have the computing resources to be able to deploy these pro-privacy technologies, because that costs a lot of computing power that you cannot do when you're sitting in a basement with your own server. At one point, they woke up to the fact that they were like, oh, wait, every time we now say we do pro-privacy work, we also are part of the machine that consolidates power in the hands of these big companies. And that exact question of what does a response to that look like is one of the biggest things that I see NGOs grapple with. It was also the topic of 2 of the chapters in the book, by Siobhan Kol-Sahib and by Michael Veal. And I think Michael's analysis is in that sense a very good one, and one that I also subscribe to, which is we need to have tools to undo some of the harms that come from this political economy. And there are different efforts that are being undertaken there. For instance, Ofcom is working on anti-competition for cloud computing as it relates to generative AI. The FTC is looking into this. The European Commission has indicated that they want to look at this, even though they've also said they have no money for it. But setting that small problem aside, and again, there are some ifs and buts around anti-competition, but this is the direction that I see a lot of people in the field look towards. And it's also something that I hope to sort of pick up both as an advocacy project, as someone who's very much a reluctant academic, but also because I believe that this is somewhere where now 2.5 years out from the DPhil, I think this is actually one of the topics where I could go back into the field and maybe make a difference that is actionable for people who are trying to do the good work, but are faced with this David and Goliath kind of situation.
Thank you. What time is it? We have
Any questions?
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
course. I will move to see if we have also a question from the audience. But yeah, feel free to start.
I used to work for Cisco Systems, and
My
some
condolences.
time ago they have introduced so-called zero trust architecture. So it's a trust model based on continuous authentication and monitoring. So it's like entering university premises wearing the badge. So as long as you displaying the badge, you're fine. As soon as you remove the badge, you'll be escorted. Do you see any trend in contemporary trust models towards this zero trust architecture?
I think very much so, but in very controlled circumstances. Like, as you said, within an organization can pull it off. But if you can define every single interaction within your control and say, I'm going to control all of these interactions, then a zero trust model is maybe viable. I think there's a slippage there because the question is, where are you placing your reliance? Zero trust models, in my view, I think for given cases, they might work really well, but they're also very brittle. Right? Because if you compromise the root of your zero trust model, you compromise the whole model. And when you think about any scale beyond an individual organization, you think about the scale of the internet and the complex sets of interdependencies between organizations. As I said, 70,000 interconnected networks right now, more than that. The range of technologies that are dependent on one another. Zero trust is not viable. There's no way in which it would ever be viable. I don't think there's any world in which that's possible, short of a single company owning and managing all internet infrastructure.
I was just about to say,
Short of
that's not far off from where we're heading.
No, I think we're actually very far off from that.
Oh, interesting.
I don't think that's ever a viable possibility. Because if you think about it, everywhere that there's the internet, there is a network, and that network is managed by a different organization. Right? Who owns the ISP that you connect to? Google doesn't most of the time. Right?
In the US and some
And
parts,
the US, but if you go across the rest of the world,
less
right?
so.
Sure. I mean, you've made efforts, Facebook, Facebook Basics, and all of these efforts, right, have been out there. But ultimately, there is a network administrator, a cybersecurity engineer, technical person managing a network somewhere on the ground. And that's how you get your internet. When the Wi-Fi went down, you go back to the office. That's how we get our internet. Right? As long as that remains true, and I don't think it's ever going to go away, I think this will that's still a possibility because those are where not just the slippage, but I think it's just a feature of the system that we don't pay enough attention to.
Thank you, Ashwin.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting talk. I have a question for you, I think. I thought it was really interesting with like the assurance structures. And I think like a thought that I had about it, and I wonder, I'm sure you thought more about this, so I was wanting to ask this question. So like, I feel like when you talked about these like the security engineers and how they work with trust, this like reminded me of like maybe like back in the day, smaller communities, but also these days activist communities, where this is actually how trust works, and like how these communities work. But what I'm thinking is like, I think usually it fails at the scale because you need to know people in person, and that's usually where it fails.
Yep.
So there's this like famous thing where if a group becomes bigger than 150 people, whatever arbitrary number, then like you need some other kind of organization because it's too large. So like what I'm wondering is why is this not the case, of course, for like these networks of like trust. And I'm wondering like my like first intuition was like it could go both ways, like two ways. Either it is so essential that it cannot be replaced because all the other ways we replaced it with, for example, now in like governance, like we vote, but like look at the political system. Why do we want the internet to like rely on something this brittle? Also, will majority vote really do it? Do we actually trust our politicians? Anyway, so like big questions.
Yeah.
So you think it's either because it's so essential, or do you think as soon as more people will realize how brittle it is and how much on interpersonal trust it relies, and as we become more individualized as a society, that like it will be forced upon these systems of interpersonal trust that there will be like an assurance structure because we realize we don't trust the interpersonal trust. Also, like, Corinne, you're free to answer too. I'm just like
No, I trust this.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I trust you to be able to answer the question much better than I can, so.
like,
Okay, so lots to unpack there. But let me start with trust and risk. I think are theoretically useful, but it's important to pay attention to the nature of risk and the consequent nature of the trust that evolves, which is why I had these two cases where the trust formed in network operator communities is more open and it's more welcoming, saying the more people we can bring in, the more relationships I have, the more people I can call when something goes wrong. Where at cybersecurity companies, it's the opposite, because the nature of risk is different. And therefore, the nature of trust has to be much more focused. The amount of work you put into saying, do I trust that person, this individual or not? You wouldn't probably put that much work in a network operator community. You might eventually, depending on what the stakes are, but as the stakes become higher, the nature of that vetting, that validation changes. Right? Activist communities are a case in point. The nature of vetting, like, is this person a government plant? Right? Right? Are you? But is this person a government plant? Like, how can I work around this? And the moment, to your point again, the moment that environment is violated, that you find, oh, someone has been a government plant, they have been here, all of a sudden you look at everyone around you, say, can I trust anyone now? And I wouldn't say that that's the brittle nature of trust, but it's the brittleness that risk brings with it, the particular kinds of risk when you're in very high stakes environments. In terms of sizes, yes, I think the higher the stakes, smaller the groups. Cybersecurity engineers would talk to me about how they have been part of many different information sharing groups over their careers. And at every single group, they would see grow larger and larger and larger. And all of a sudden, people would hive off and fall smaller groups because they're like, oh, we started with 5 people, now there are 120. I don't know everyone. I need a group that I can trust. And that they would talk about that. This is something we observe in our careers. Right? This keeps happening. The final point that I will make to your question about atomization and individualism, right? Will people come for our interpersonal trust? Many scholars would argue that trust is coextensive with reality. Right? The question is, given the different kinds of risks we encounter, how does it play out? Ernst Gellner makes this really interesting argument where he talks about something he calls the trust paradox. And the paradox is that in order to trust someone, you need to be able to take a risk on them. Right? If you have a zero trust environment and you say, I've taken away all the risk, all of a sudden you don't need to trust someone anymore. And so that's when you get a completely atomized society where you say, oh, I'm just going to walk by people because I don't need to trust anyone. I don't need to build any relationships here. Again, will that ever occur? I don't think in any absolute sense, right? But that's the danger for me of increasingly securitized political environments, where all we can talk about is the other security, control, because then we lose the resilience that interpersonal trust gives us. And we end up with these very brittle environments.
Thank you. There's one question online and then we move to the back of the room. We also started a bit late, so we might, I don't know, add 2-3 more minutes if that's okay for people.
Also, if people need to leave because they have families or anything else, by all means, we know that this is after term and we're very glad that you're in the room at all. So that will, we'll try and keep it short.
A brief question by your colleague Willy online. Willy is pointing out that we made a normative assumption that infrastructure is governed by expert community or trust network. And Willy is asking if it's actually a good assumption to be made. And if we can interrogate this.
So for me, it's less an assumption and more an empirical finding from my research. I think that normative assumptions that we start with are infrastructure is governed by corporations, infrastructure is governed by governments. And those are the assumptions that we start with. And I'm not saying that those assumptions are untrue. I'm saying that there's another set of explanations that interact with those that we already have. That I think we lose something when we don't pay attention to the explanation of trust.
But do you think it's a desirable way to do it, or there's like another way to like govern this infrastructure that might be actually more efficient or more safe without a layer of trust?
Before we even go there, I think this is actually where you and I increasingly diverge in what we see in our field works, right? This is not even a question of you and I disagreeing, but the internet that I see is one that is increasingly governed by corporations. And that is because like I think a lot of the key material parts of the infrastructure, whether we're talking about cables, which used to be owned by consortia of telecommunications companies, are now owned by GAFAM. And these cables are a fundamental part of the backbone of the internet. And these cables tend to connect to data centers, and these data centers are increasingly run by AWS, Microsoft, etc. And I do think we have to ask some questions there around, for those particular case studies, for when it comes to cloud computing and cables, the spaces where I feel more at home at the moment. This is not about trusted communities in the same way, and they play a role because ISPs in the end are connected to cables. But some of the most fundamental decisions about like how this backbone is run is quite far removed from how we think about internet governance communities.
And can I?
Yeah, I mean, we have one more question in the back of the room, but yeah, go ahead.
I don't disagree with you.
Oh, I know.
And I think that these are orthogonal explanations of power, and one doesn't exclude the other.
No.
What's happening is there's a concentration of control in infrastructure, and that comes from an ownership of larger and larger segments of infrastructure. What hasn't happened so far that I'm encouraged by is that concentration of control is not so far, just to some degree, enacted through changes in the fundamental protocols. And some of that is happening as well, and there have been arguments to have more centralized zero trust-like models in the protocols. If that were to happen, I think we'd be in real danger, because then we wouldn't even have the room for maneuver that I've been seeing.
That these communities have, right?
Because I think that we have two problems. One is architecturally, when do things get centralized? And the other is, in a market organized world, when does market concentration happen? Those are two different questions.
Time for one last brief question. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, so since you started the book, obviously the elephant in the room is that LLMs have become this enormous thing, and I feel like a lot of the tech companies now draw their battle lines in chips and compute architecture, not necessarily kind of infrastructure or cloud compute. That feels like a big change since 2020. So yeah, maybe you could comment on how this battle over chips, AI chips for generative AI will change the nature of competition among big tech and the nature of power distribution in the ecosystem as a whole?
Excellent question. So how we think about it in the research group that I'm part of is somewhat of a stacked model. So at the top, you have the LLMs, which are a particular type of infrastructure. These LLMs run on cloud computing infrastructure, right? You can't disconnect these two. And I know a lot of people are just like, the AI, and I'm like, the AI only exists within the infrastructural context of cloud computing. And there are only 3 companies that like have major stakes in this market. So whenever anyone says anything about AI as disconnected from that computational infrastructure, I think you're losing a big part of the story. And these cloud computing companies, as you said, rely on the chips, right? And at each layer, it's kind of like a funnel. So at the LLMs, we have quite a number of companies who are doing this. At the cloud computing layer, we have fewer. And at the chips, we literally have a couple.
And only one.
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on how you look at ASML versus NVIDIA. Like there are nuances, there are discussions to be had there, but in terms of how that changes the dynamic, it does so massively. And you saw that even today when Oracle announced that they would be working together with NVIDIA for their cloud computing business. And all of a sudden their stocks like just went up by 13 or 14% in a day. Because all of a sudden people were like, oh, well, we all want to make a buck off of AI. We don't really have anywhere concrete to put that. And one of the interesting things that I've done for my research now, I've talked to some of the biggest venture capitalists in Europe who are trying to figure out how to make money out of AI when the nicest thing we've built at this point is a chatbot for Amazon Web Services. Rufus, go check it out. It is janky, and this is what we built with AI. So as soon as, this is also why NVIDIA stock has soared so much, because anyone who wants to make some money off of this puts it in a company where it's very concrete what it means. And that also happened to Oracle. And at the same time, you also see all of these weird dynamic where NVIDIA, because it's the only one who makes the chips, they're both dealing with the shortage, but they also have an enormous amount of leverage because they get to pick who they sell to. And who they sell to, subsequently, that will be the company that can then, use that for all sorts of applications. And it's completely unclear at this time how they make those choices. So yes, absolutely. I wouldn't say so much that it's the LLMs that have changed the power dynamic here, but there's definitely something in that funnel that is happening that we all need to keep an eye out for.
Thank you very much.
Thank all of you for coming out. And also for people who want to keep chatting, we will probably find a pub with something to drink and something to eat. So feel free to join if you have time.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.